The morning mist clung to the hollers of eastern Kentucky like cigarette smoke in a roadhouse, thick and stubborn, refusing to let go. Earl Hutchins sat on his porch swing, watching the sun struggle through the fog, painting everything in shades of gray that matched his mood. The coffee in his weathered hands had gone cold an hour ago, but he didn't notice. These days, he noticed less and less. It had been 8 months since Martha passed, 8 months since the cancer finally claimed the woman who had been his compass for 43 years. The house felt too big now, too quiet, filled with echoes of laughter that would never return. Their grandson Tyler had moved back to Cincinnati after the funeral, taking with him the last real connection Earl had to the world beyond these mountains. The mail truck's rumbling engine broke through his reverie. Bobby Jenkins, the postman, waved from the cab as he stuffed letters into the rusty mailbox at the end of Earl's gravel drive. Earl raised his hand in acknowledgement but didn't get up. Nothing in that mailbox would change anything. Bills, advertisements, maybe another sympathy card from someone who'd just heard the news. Small towns move slowly, even with their grief. But something made him stand anyway, his 72-year-old knees protesting as they always did. Maybe it was Martha's voice, still echoing in his head after all these months, telling him to stop feeling sorry for himself and do something useful. She'd never been one for self-pity, his Martha. "Life's too short to waste it sitting still," she used to say, usually while dragging him to some church function or community meeting he'd rather avoid. The walk to the mailbox felt longer than usual, his work boots crunching on the gravel that needed fresh stone. He'd been meaning to call his nephew about spreading a new load, but like everything else lately, it stayed on his mental list, never quite making it to reality. The mailbox creaked as he opened it, revealing the usual stack of papers that would mostly end up in the trash. But there, between a credit card offer and the electric bill, was an envelope that made him pause. The return address read, Harlan County Recreation Department, and something about the official letterhead stirred a memory he couldn't quite place. Earl tore it open right there on the road, not waiting for the privacy of his porch. The letter was typed on county stationery, signed by someone named Jennifer Morrison, Director of Youth Services. It explained that due to budget cuts, the county's youth baseball program was being discontinued. The letter asked if Earl might be interested in donating the old baseball field behind his property to the county, as they were looking for ways to preserve recreational spaces, even if they couldn't fund programs to use them. Earl stared at the letter for a long time, the words blurring as unexpected tears filled his eyes. The baseball field. He'd forgotten anyone even knew it existed anymore. Martha had insisted they build it back in 1987, when Tyler was just 6 years old and spending summers with them. She'd convinced Earl to clear the back meadow, level the ground, and put up a proper fence with a backstop. "Every boy needs a place to play baseball," she'd said, and Earl had grumbled about the expense even as he fell in love with the project. For 10 years, that field had been Tyler's kingdom. Summer after summer, the boy would arrive from Cincinnati with his glove and his dreams, and Earl would pitch to him for hours while Martha cheered from a lawn chair in the shade. They'd invited neighbor kids over for pickup games, and sometimes Earl would organize little tournaments, complete with prizes Martha bought from the dollar store in town. But Tyler grew up, as boys do. High school brought other interests, and college took him further away. The field grew weeds and collected memories, and Earl told himself he didn't mind. Life moved on. People moved on. That was the way of things. Now, standing in the morning mist with this letter in his hands, Earl felt something shift inside his chest. It wasn't quite hope. He wasn't ready for that yet. But it wasn't despair either. It was possibility, fragile as new grass, but real nonetheless. That afternoon, Earl walked out to the old field for the first time in years. The weeds were waist-high in places, and the backstop sagged like an old man's shoulders, but the bones of the field were still there. The pitcher's mound was a small hill now, covered in Queen Anne's lace and wild clover. But Earl could see where home plate used to be, could trace the baselines in his mind, even though they'd long since disappeared under the encroaching wilderness. He stood there until the sun started to set, remembering Tyler's voice calling, "Pop, throw me a fastball," and Martha's laughter when the boy swung so hard he spun himself into the dirt. This field had been full of life once. Maybe it could be again. The next morning, Earl called the number on the letter. Jennifer Morrison sounded surprised to hear from him, and even more surprised when he said he didn't want to donate the field to the county. Instead, he had a different proposition. "What if we started the program back up?" Earl asked, his voice stronger than it had been in months. "What if we brought baseball back to these kids?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Hutchins, I appreciate the sentiment, but we don't have the funding. That's why we had to cancel the program in the first place." "What if funding wasn't the problem?" Earl pressed. "What would you need to make it work?" Jennifer's voice took on a cautious interest. "Well, we'd need insurance, liability coverage, equipment, transportation for some of the kids. We'd need coaches, volunteers, someone to coordinate everything. It's not just about having a field, Mr. Hutchins. It's about building a whole program." Earl listened to every word, making mental notes. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Let me make some calls." "Can you send me a list of what we'd need?" "Everything. Don't leave anything out because of cost. Just tell me what it would take to give these kids a real baseball program." Over the next 2 weeks, Earl threw himself into research with an energy he hadn't felt since before Martha's diagnosis. He learned about insurance requirements and safety regulations. He called sporting goods companies and got quotes on equipment. He contacted the other retired men in the area, guys he'd worked with at the mine or known from church, feeling them out about volunteer coaching. The responses were mixed. Some thought he was crazy. "Earl, you're 72 years old. You trying to kill yourself with work?" asked his old foreman, Jim Bradley. But others were intrigued. Pete Lawson, who taught high school for 30 years before retiring, said he'd been looking for something meaningful to do with his time. Danny Wright, who'd lost his job when the lumber mill closed, admitted he missed being around kids. Earl's biggest supporter turned out to be someone he barely knew. Reverend Sarah Chen had been the pastor at Mount Carmel Baptist for only 2 years, having come to Harlan County straight from seminary with ideas about community outreach that had raised eyebrows among the older congregation members. When Earl approached her about using the church as a base for organizing the league, she didn't just agree, she volunteered to help coordinate everything. "This is exactly what these kids need," she said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "Not just baseball, but men in their lives who care about them, who show up consistently. Do you know how many single mothers we have in this county? How many fathers working 2 jobs just to keep food on the table? These boys need role models, Mr. Hutchins. They need community." Earl found himself nodding, surprised by the passion in her voice. He'd been thinking about baseball, about giving kids something fun to do, but Reverend Chen was talking about something bigger, something that made his chest tight with emotions he wasn't ready to name. The hardest part was the money. Earl had saved carefully over the years, but a full baseball program would require thousands of dollars for equipment, insurance, field maintenance, and transportation. He spent sleepless nights doing calculations, trying to figure out how to make it work without bankrupting himself. The solution came from an unexpected source. Tyler called one evening in March, just as Earl was sitting down to another solitary dinner of canned soup and crackers. "Pop, I've been thinking about Grandma a lot lately," Tyler said, his voice carrying clearly over the phone lines. "I keep remembering that baseball field you built for me. I know I never said it properly, but those summers with you and Grandma, playing ball out there, those were the best times of my childhood." Earl nodded, feeling Martha's presence so strongly it almost took his breath away. She was in the laughter of children playing in the yard, in the satisfaction of work that mattered, in the knowledge that loneliness wasn't a life sentence if you opened your heart to love in new forms. The second season brought 37 boys and girls. Reverend Chen had convinced Earl to expand the program to include girls after her daughter begged to play. It brought new challenges too. More equipment needs, more complex scheduling, personality conflicts between kids from different schools and backgrounds. But it also brought proof that what they'd built was working. Several of the original Hawks had made their middle school teams, carrying themselves with new confidence. Jimmy Mullins was elected class president of his 8th grade, running on a platform of inclusion and kindness that reflected everything he'd learned about teamwork. Marcus Thompson's grades had improved so dramatically that he was being considered for the county's gifted program. Earl found himself becoming a fixture in the community beyond baseball. Parents sought his advice on everything from discipline to college planning. The local newspaper wrote a feature story about the Hawks that was picked up by papers in Lexington and Louisville. A sporting goods company donated equipment after hearing about the program. But the moment that really mattered came on a Tuesday evening in July. Earl was working late at the field, repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm, when he heard footsteps behind him. He turned to find a teenager he didn't recognize. Tall, lean, wearing a University of Kentucky baseball cap. "Excuse me, sir," the young man said. "Are you Coach Hutchins?" Earl nodded, setting down his tools. There was something familiar about the boy's face, but he couldn't place it. "My name's Michael Patterson. My little brother Danny plays for the Hawks. He's the kid who catches for the 12-year-old team." Recognition dawned. Danny Patterson was one of Earl's favorite players, a quiet boy with natural leadership skills who always encouraged his teammates and never complained when things didn't go his way. "Danny's a fine ball player," Earl said, "and a finer young man. You should be proud of him." Michael smiled, and Earl could see the family resemblance clearly now. "That's actually what I wanted to talk to you about. See, Danny hasn't always been like that. 3 years ago, after our dad left, Danny was angry all the time. He was getting in fights at school, giving our mom nothing but trouble. We didn't know what to do with him." Earl felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he got whenever he heard about the struggles these kids faced at home. "Then Danny joined the Hawks," Michael continued, "and everything changed. Not overnight. It took time. But week by week, he started coming home different, calmer, happier. He started talking about teamwork and respect and never giving up. All the things you teach out here." The young man paused, looking out at the field where his brother had learned those lessons. "I'm heading off to UK in the fall on a baseball scholarship. I'm the first person in my family to go to college. And I wanted you to know that in a way, you made that possible too. Because Danny becoming the kid he is now, that gave our mom hope. It showed her that we weren't destined to repeat all the mistakes our dad made. She started believing in us again. And when she started believing in us, we started believing in ourselves." Earl stood in the gathering darkness, overwhelmed by the weight of this young man's words. He'd known the Hawks were making a difference, but hearing it articulated so clearly, understanding the ripple effects that spread far beyond the baseball field, was almost too much to process. "Danny's lucky to have a brother like you," Earl managed to say. Michael shook his head. "We're all lucky to have you, Coach. You probably don't realize it, but you've saved more than one family in this county. My mom says you're an angel disguised as a grumpy old baseball coach." After Michael left, Earl sat on the bleachers until well past midnight, thinking about the strange paths that lead us to our purpose. 2 years ago, he'd been a broken-hearted widower, counting down his days in an empty house. Now he was somehow responsible for a program that was changing lives, including his own. The third season brought recognition from the state recreation department and an invitation to participate in a regional tournament. It brought college scouts who'd heard about the program and wanted to see what was happening in this remote corner of Kentucky. Most importantly, it brought the news that several other counties were starting their own versions of the Hawks, inspired by Earl's model of community-supported youth baseball. Earl was standing behind the batting cage during practice one afternoon when he felt a sharp pain in his chest, followed by a dizziness that made him grab the fence for support. Pete Lawson noticed immediately and insisted on driving Earl to the county hospital, despite Earl's protests that he was fine. The doctor was a young woman who looked like she might be Tyler's age, and she didn't mince words. "Mr. Hutchins, you've had a mild heart attack. Your EKG shows some irregularities that concern me. I want to keep you overnight and run some more tests." Earl's first thought wasn't about his health. It was about that evening's practice, about the boys who would be showing up expecting him to be there. He tried to argue with the doctor, but she was as stubborn as Martha had been, and Earl found himself admitted to the cardiac unit with strict orders to rest. Tyler arrived the next morning, having driven through the night from Cincinnati. He looked tired and worried, and Earl felt a stab of guilt for putting his grandson through another health scare so soon after losing his grandmother. "Pop, you're going to have to slow down," Tyler said, pulling a chair up to Earl's hospital bed. "The doctor says you've been pushing yourself too hard. Your blood pressure is through the roof, and your cholesterol levels are dangerous. You can't keep going like this." Earl wanted to argue, but the truth was, he felt exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. 3 years of pouring his entire being into the Hawks had taken a toll he'd been too proud or too focused to acknowledge. "What am I supposed to do?" Earl asked, his voice smaller than he liked. "Those kids are counting on me. If I step back now, the whole program might fall apart." Tyler was quiet for a moment, looking out the hospital window at the mountains that had shaped both their lives. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "Pop, do you remember what you used to tell me when I was playing ball, and I'd get frustrated because I couldn't do everything myself?" Earl smiled despite his worry. "Baseball's a team sport. You can't win games by yourself, but you can sure lose them trying." "That's right. And what you built with the Hawks, it's bigger than any one person now. Pete and Reverend Chen and all the other volunteers, they're not just helping you. They're part of something they believe in. Maybe it's time to trust them to carry some of the weight." The conversation continued over the next several days as Earl recovered. Tyler had taken time off work to stay in Kentucky, and father and grandson spent hours talking about the future of the Hawks program. They discussed succession planning, fundraising sustainability, and how to ensure the program's mission would continue even as leadership changed. It was Reverend Chen who provided the solution. She visited Earl on his third day in the hospital, bringing flowers from the church garden and a proposal that took his breath away. "Earl, I've been talking with Pete and the other volunteers, and we want to establish the Hawks as an official nonprofit organization. We want to create a board of directors with you as chairman emeritus. You'd still be involved, but you wouldn't have to carry the day-to-day burden alone." She pulled out a folder filled with paperwork she'd already started preparing. "Tyler's company has offered to help with the legal work, and we've got commitments from local businesses to serve on the board. The goal is to expand the program to serve more kids while making sure it stays true to the values you've established." Earl stared at the documents, amazed by how much thought and work had already gone into this plan. These people who'd become his partners in the Hawks weren't just trying to help him recover. They were showing him that what he'd started had taken on a life of its own. "There's one more thing," Reverend Chen said, her voice taking on a note of excitement. "The county has approached us about developing a regional youth sports complex. They want to name it the Martha Hutchins Memorial Athletic Center, in honor of your wife and her commitment to children in the community." Earl felt tears welling up in his eyes. Martha's name on a building that would serve kids for generations to come. It was more than he'd ever dreamed possible. The recovery took longer than Earl wanted, but less time than Tyler feared. By the start of the fourth season, Earl was back on the field, moving a little slower, but with his passion for the program intact. The Hawks now served 68 children across 3 age divisions, with a waiting list that stretched into the next county. The Memorial Athletic Center was dedicated on a perfect September afternoon, with Martha's picture displayed prominently in the lobby, alongside photos from the Hawks' first 3 seasons. Earl stood at the podium, looking out at faces that had become as familiar as family. Players and parents, volunteers and community leaders who'd all contributed to something none of them could have built alone. "Martha always said that love multiplies when you give it away," Earl told the crowd, his voice steady despite the emotion he felt. "She was right about that, like she was right about most things. What we built here isn't just about baseball. It's about showing kids that they matter, that their dreams are worth pursuing, that there are adults in their lives they can count on." He paused, looking at the banner that would hang in the center. "Martha Hutchins Memorial Athletic Center, where champions are made." Earl continued, "The real champions aren't the ones who win the most games. They're the kids who learn that quitting isn't an option, that teammates support each other, that character matters more than talent. They're the kids who take those lessons home and use them to build better lives for themselves and their families." As the crowd applauded, Earl caught sight of some of his original Hawks players. Jimmy Mullins was now a sophomore in high school, starting shortstop on the varsity team and president of the student council. Marcus Thompson had made the honor roll 3 semesters in a row and was talking about becoming a teacher. Danny Patterson was following in his brother's footsteps, working toward a baseball scholarship and college dreams that had once seemed impossible. But it was Tommy Chen who provided the afternoon's most meaningful moment. Now 11 years old and one of the Hawks' veteran players, he approached Earl after the ceremony with a question that nearly broke the old man's heart. "Coach Earl, I've been thinking about something. You know how you always tell us that we'll always be Hawks, even when we're too old to play?" Earl nodded, wondering where this was leading. "Well, I want to be a coach someday, just like you. I want to help kids the way you helped me. Will you teach me how to do that?" Earl knelt down to Tommy's level, just as he had 3 years earlier, when the boy was worried about moving away. But this time, Tommy's eyes held hope instead of sadness, confidence instead of fear. "Son," Earl said, his voice thick with pride, "I can't think of anything I'd rather do." That evening, as the celebration wound down and families headed home, Earl found himself alone on the pitcher's mound of the original field. The Memorial Center was beautiful and would serve the community for decades to come, but this patch of ground would always be special, the place where dreams had first taken root, where an old man's grief had transformed into purpose. Tyler joined him there, just as the first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky. "Pop, I hope you know what you've accomplished here. This isn't just about baseball anymore. It's about community, about giving kids hope for the future. You've changed this whole region." Earl shook his head. "I didn't do this alone, Tyler. I couldn't have. This is what happens when people decide to care about each other, when they choose to invest in the next generation instead of just worrying about themselves." They stood together in comfortable silence, grandfather and grandson, connected by shared memories and shared love. The field was quiet now, but in a few months it would come alive again with the sounds of spring training. Young voices calling encouragement, the crack of bat on ball, the patient instruction of volunteers who understood that they were teaching much more than athletics. Earl thought about Martha, about how proud she would be of what her belief in the power of community had helped create. He thought about all the boys and girls who would benefit from this program in the years to come, kids who didn't even know yet that they needed what the Hawks could provide. The heart attack had been a wake-up call, a reminder that his time was limited and precious. But instead of making him afraid, it had taught him something profound. The best way to honor a life is to live it in service to others, to plant seeds that will grow long after the planter is gone. As they walked back toward the house, Tyler asked, "Pop, do you ever regret not doing something like this sooner? Before Grandma got sick, I mean?" Earl considered the question carefully. "Tyler, I've learned that life doesn't always give us what we expect, but it usually gives us what we need, exactly when we need it. If I'd started this program 10 years ago, I might not have had the wisdom that comes from loss, the understanding of how precious time really is. And these particular kids, the ones we've helped so far, they needed the Hawks exactly when they got them." He paused at the gate to his yard, looking back at the field that had started as one man's memorial to his wife and become a community's investment in its future. Sometimes the best things in life come from the worst times if we're brave enough to let grief teach us about love instead of just about loss. The stars were fully visible now, scattered across the mountain sky like possibilities waiting to be realized. Somewhere in the darkness, children were dreaming dreams that might come true because adults had decided to care. And in a house that no longer felt empty, an old man was planning tomorrow's practice, confident that the most important season of his life was just beginning.